In the previous video, we discussed about the useState hook, and we also covered a brief introduction to the useEffect hook that is used to define side effects. So by the English definition, a side effect is something that interacts with the outside world. If you want to learn what a side effect could potentially be in JavaScript, I have discussed this in great detail in one of my JavaScript videos. The link for the same can be found down below in the description section of this video. Some of the common side effects that we typically do all the time are HTTP requests, DOM manipulations. Now to encapsulate all these side effects, we can make use of another React hook, which is called as the useEffect hook. So with the useEffect hook, you can perform side effects in your functional components. So whenever you want to interact with the world that is outside the React land, you can make use of the useEffect hook to do so. So for example, when we make an async call to fetch some data from an API, typically this is what comes under a side effect, because here we are interacting with an environment that is outside the React land or outside the browser environment to get some data into our React application. Now here we will understand the useEffect hook in great depth. Now let us first see how we can introduce a useEffect hook into a React component. So the syntax is something like this. So we have our useEffect hook, to which we pass a function that defines our side effect. Now by default, React will invoke the effect after every render. To see this in action, let us see an example. So I've already created an effect component, and if we check this, so here let us understand how this works. So here you can see we are having a useEffect hook, and let me open the console here. So here let us understand how this works. So on the initial render, we have a state value for counter that is set to 0. We also have our effect, but it is not going to run yet. So React just keeps it for later purpose. So React here for the very first time will update the DOM. In the browser, it repaints with the DOM updates. Now once the update is done, React is going to invoke the effect. So now if the user clicks on the increment button, React is going to increment the counter value by 1. So here we are using the functional form of the state updating function. So this increment of the counter by 1 will trigger a re-render, and then the count will get updated to 1. So let us click on increment counter. So here it gets updated to 1. So this triggers a re-render. Again our component function runs. Now this time we again set up another effect, and this time again we get the log in effect.js after render. So it is showing 2 logs here. Now once the component re-renders after the click of the increment button, this time we again set up another effect, and again React saves it for later purpose. React then updates the DOM, browser repaints the UI with the DOM updates, and after that is when React finally invokes the effect, and it is because of that we got the second log. So here let me comment this first and bring the API call effect function. So now let us see another example where we are making an API call to fetch a specific to-do with the ID of 1. So as we discussed in our lesson for useEffect, that useEffect is used to fire side effects. So here in the code example, you can see we are placing an API call, which is our side effect, inside the function that useEffect takes, which is this function. So we are calling the fetch to-do function, and then whatever to-do we get back from the API call, we return the promise for that in the fetch to-do, and then we tack on .then here. So whatever to-do we get back from our API call, we commit that to our to-do piece of state, which is this one right here, by using the state updating function. Make sense? Now this in turn causes a re-render, and we will get our UI. Let me reload this. Now can you spot out any problem in this code? Let us do a quick try run again to see what actually happens. So the very first time our component gets rendered, we set the to-do to an empty array. Not to an empty array, but an empty object. So to begin with, we have the empty object for our to-do piece of state. Now React then goes ahead and runs the effect function. After it is done updating the React DOM, and the browser has painted those changes to the DOM. The browser paints those changes to the DOM, and after that our effect function runs, where we make our API call to the JSON placeholder API to fetch the to-do with the ID of 1. So once we get back the to-do, then we call the set to-do state updating function. This then triggers a re-render, and this renders the UI to the browser showing the ID and the title for the to-do that we got. So ID is 1 and to-do is this. But then, as we had discussed, that after a render, React will update the DOM, browser will paint those changes to the DOM, and then our effect function reruns. So this time we again make another API call to the JSON placeholder API requesting for the to-do with the ID of 1. So once we get that back, we again call setToDo that updates the to-do piece of state, and due to this state change, again causing a re-render. And due to this state change, another re-render happens. Then React updates the DOM and the browser paints those DOM updates, and then again our effect function reruns. So you can see we are stuck in an infinite loop here. And here you can see it is running infinite times. So you can see this count is increasing. We are getting an infinite number of logs. So this is not something we want here. So here for this very case where we just want the to-do with the ID of 1, we only want to invoke the effect function, which is this one, on the initial render and not on the subsequent re-renders. So fortunately, useEffect provides a second argument using which we can customize this. So as a second argument right here, we pass a list of dependencies on which our effect function depends on. So let's move back to our slides to understand all the cases that we can have for useEffect. So the first use case is this. So here the side effect function gets invoked on the initial render and on all the subsequent re-renders, and it is because of this case we were getting an infinite loop in our API called side effect example. Then the second case is this one where the side effect function gets invoked only on the initial render. So for this to happen, you have to pass a second argument to the useEffect function, which is an empty list of dependencies. Then the third case is this one where the side effect function gets invoked first on the initial render, and thereafter whenever there is a change in either of the dependencies that we specify in the list of dependencies. So here we have ID1, ID2, ID3. So if either of them changes, that will cause a re-execution of our effect function. So back to where we were. So for this example, our effect function doesn't depend on any value. So we just put an empty array like this. And if I now reload this, you can see now we are out of that infinite loop. So now our side effect function runs only and only on the initial render. Make sense? But there is a problem. What if I want to fetch a to-do with a different ID? So let me demonstrate the second example for this. So comment this and uncomment this one. So here again we have our API called effect function, and this time we have a button that we use to increment the ID. So on the click of the button, we call the increment ID function, which in turn causes a state update for ID, triggers a re-render. This then updates the DOM, repaints the component view with the browser updates. Now anytime the ID changes, and only when the ID changes, it causes the effect function to get re-executed and thus synchronizes our to-do state with the API call. So this has two implications. One, our effect function no longer runs on subsequent renders as what we saw in the first case. Second, the effect function here will first run on the initial render, and thereafter whenever there is a change in either of the dependencies. So this is how we can skip the re-execution of the effect function if none of the dependencies change. Only when either of the dependencies experience a change does the effect function reruns. So let us try this out. If I click on increment ID, the ID changes to 2. This causes a re-render of the component. The ID changed, and this executes the side effect on the change of the ID. So we again fetch a to-do for the ID 2, and this you can see we are getting right here. So you can see this works. Now let us cover the next scenario that requires cleanup, like a subscription-based API. So in such cases, we need to clean up our subscriptions when the component is removed from the DOM. Otherwise, these subscriptions will pile up and cause memory leaks in our application. So this brings us to the last part of the useEffect, which is the cleanup function. So let us see the basic syntax for this. So from the useEffect function, if we return a function, React will make sure that the function is invoked right before invoking the new effect on a re-render and right before removing the component from the DOM. So let us see an example to understand the cleanup case. So here let me first comment this and uncomment the effect with cleanup code. So comment this as well and uncomment this and this state as well and the import for useState. So here is the component that I have already defined for you, which is the effect with cleanup. And here we are managing coordinates as our states, where as an initial value we have 0 for the x coordinate and 0 for the y coordinate as well. Next, on the very first render of the component, we want to trigger the execution of the side effect function. So here we would need an empty array of dependencies. So first we are logging useEffect-ran to the console, and then we are registering an event listener for the mouse move event on the window object. So once that happens, so we call this handle coordinate update function, which in turn calls our state updating functions for x and y coordinates. So here we are calling our state updating functions, namely set x coordinate and set y coordinate, respectively with the new coordinate values that we get from the event object, as you can see right here. So this causes a state update and causes a re-render of the component. React performs the DOM updates and repaints the DOM updates in the browser. Now for the cleanup case, I have already added some code in app.js where we have a piece of state with the name is visible, and then we also have a button, which is this one. Let me uncomment this. So on the click of this button, we toggle our is visible boolean state. So this is how we simulate the unmounting of the effect with cleanup function. So here we are using the short circuit operator. So if the is visible boolean state is true, then mount the effect with cleanup component, else unmount it. Makes sense? So let me click on toggle. Okay, so this unmounts the component and runs our useEffect function for the effect with cleanup component. So this cleanup code gets executed when the is visible gets set to false, which unmounts the component. So on the unmounting of the effect with cleanup component, this code ran, which does the cleanup. It removes the event listener for the mouse move event and logs cleanup to the console. So the idea here is that once the effect with cleanup component unmounts, this will trigger our cleanup function that we have defined in our useEffect for the effect with cleanup component. So in the effect with cleanup component inside our useEffect hook, we are returning a function right here, and it first logs to the console cleanup, then it removes the listener for the mouse move event that we had earlier registered on the very first render of this component. So with this in place, let us give this a preview, and you can see we can toggle. So useEffect-ran. If I click on toggle, this unmounts the effect with cleanup component and the cleanup gets logged to the console, which is coming from right here when the cleanup code executes for our effect with cleanup component. So this is how we perform cleanup with the useEffect hook. So this was all I wanted to cover about the useEffect hook. If you liked the video, do give it a thumbs up or comment down below if you have any query. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in the very next one.